An Indonesian official warned today the death toll from Friday's devastating earthquake and tsunami could be in the thousands. For now, officials say nearly 400 are dead and more than 500 are injured. A magnitude 7.5 earthquake sent giant waves slamming onto beaches. Homes, cars, trees and people were swept away. Rebecca Henschke of BBC News has more.
This mobile phone footage captures the terrifying moment the 3-metre-high waves hit, flooding houses close to the shore and then rushing into the densely populated coastal city of Palu. The waves and the powerful quake leaving a trail of destruction. This bridge is a main access road into the city.
Allahu Akbar.
Authorities issued a tsunami warning immediately after the huge 7.7 magnitude quake hit. But residents didn't have long to get to higher land. Rescue workers are now struggling to reach the area as 2 access roads are blocked and the airport is now closed. The runway cracked in the quake. The military has been called in to help. The main hospital in the city was also damaged and medical workers are now struggling to treat the injured in makeshift tents. The death toll is expected to continue to rise. Aftershocks are still being felt in the area and residents are being told to stay out in the open. Indonesia is in the ring of fire and no stranger to natural disasters. Earthquakes in July and August killed more than 500 people in the tourist island of Lombok. And now, so soon after, authorities are once again struggling to cope with the scale of this disaster. Rebecca Henschke, BBC News for CBS News, Sulawesi.
Collapsed buildings like this are seen across the Palu metro area now as a magnitude 7.5 earthquake has struck Indonesia. After a flurry of foreshocks which had already cracked buildings and killed 1 person, the larger rumble had already shaken the locals when disaster struck. Huge waves pound the coastline, and the footage coming in here in the early hours is shocking. More damage and footage is going to be rolling into the internet all day, so eyes open and hearts with those in Palu, Indonesia. A bit more info here. Today's entire sequence of quakes began in the wake of a low-velocity zone blood echo to the southeast, which occurred during the creation of last night's snapshot map but wasn't reported for a few hours later while we all slept. So if you had used the real-time tools, you'd have seen this region of Indonesia light up on the Prediction Center map. Given the super typhoon just to the north, that region would have remained on alert, but also the convergence lines cutting down across the faults. The northern aspect did not, but the southern one did. You will recall from the 2017 paper, one of the atmospheric parameters are those convergence lines crossing the faults.
A former Vatican ambassador who has accused Pope Francis of covering up for a disgraced American ex-cardinal is challenging the Vatican once again. Archbishop Carlo Vigano has written a new letter a month after his initial 11-page document sent shockwaves throughout the Catholic Church. It was released yesterday. Vigano is the former Vatican ambassador to the United States. Vatican correspondent Juliet Lindley joins us from Rome. Juliet, tell us what Vigano is saying.
Wyatt, Vigano accuses Pope Francis of mounting a campaign of, quote, subtle slander. The Archbishop also denounces the official Vatican silence about his claims. And he urges Cardinal Mark Welle, the current head of the Vatican Bishop's office, to speak out. Vigano says Welle has all the documentation needed to prove years of cover-up by the Vatican about alleged sexual misconduct by ex-Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. Now, in this new letter, Archbishop Vigano is saying that the Pope's unwillingness to respond to his charges and his appeals by the faithful for accountability are not consistent with Pope Francis's calls for transparency and for bridge building, Wyatt.
Archbishop Vigano's original letter last month sent the Holy Father's papacy into turmoil. Remind us what his accusations are.
Vigano accused Francis of rehabilitating Theodore McCarrick from sanctions imposed by Pope Benedict. And in that bombshell letter, he also accused more than 24 current and former Vatican officials, Wyatt, as well as a host of U.S. bishops and papal advisors, of being part of the cover-up. Vigano called on Pope Francis to resign over the scandal. Francis removed McCarrick as a cardinal in July after a church investigation determined an allegation of abuse of a teenager was credible. Now, after that, several former seminarians and priests came forward to report that they too had been abused or harassed or harassed by McCarrick as adults, and the scandal has led to a crisis in confidence in both the U.S. and Vatican hierarchies since McCarrick's penchant for seminarians was apparently an open secret in some circles. The Archdiocese of Washington announced today that McCarrick, who's 88 years old, now lives at a Capucin friary in Victoria, Kansas. The revelation ends months of mystery, Wyatt, about his whereabouts.
Well, Archbishop Vigano, on the other side here, has many critics who question his claims and say he provides no evidence. Isn't that right?
That's right, Wyatt. Now, in his original letter, Vigano claimed that Benedict had imposed sanctions against McCarrick, barring him from exercising public ministry, traveling, or lecturing, but it's not clear if any type of sanctions were ever imposed. Now, Vigano's main claim is that he told Francis of the sanctions back in June 2013 and that the Pope effectively rehabilitated McCarrick and made him a trusted advisor. Now, Pope Francis has so far refused to respond to Vigano's claims, but Francis has referred to the issue indirectly, Wyatt, in his morning homilies, speaking of the silence of Jesus before the great accuser, and it seems the Pope is comparing his own silence to that of Christ and Vigano's accusations to the work of the devil. Francis also refused to take questions about Vigano's accusations, as you'll remember, Wyatt, during his in-flight press conference returning from the Baltics on Tuesday evening.
We'll continue to follow the developments as a result of this new letter from Archbishop Vigano as well. Juliet Lindley, EWTN News Nightly Vatican correspondent.
Pope Francis today asked Catholics to pray for the protection of the Church from attacks by the devil and to pray that the Church becomes more aware of its, quote, guilt, errors, and abuses. The Pope and other Church officials are accused of covering up the sexual misconduct of American Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, who resigned over the summer. As Seth Doan reports, a Catholic institute in Rome is also accused of failing to act on the McCarrick allegations.
The Pontifical North American College, or NAC, has turned out a who's who of U.S. church leaders. Cardinals Raymond Burke, Blaise Cupich, Daniel DiNardo, Timothy Dolan, and Donald Wuerl. A regular overnight visitor to this campus, packed with Americans, was disgraced former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, who visited as recently as May, only weeks before resigning. A former student at NAC, Bishop Stephen Lopes, said in a homily he doesn't believe the parade of cardinals and bishops who denied knowing about the sexual misconduct allegations swirling around McCarrick.
I was a seminarian when Theodore McCarrick was named Archbishop of Newark, and he would visit the seminary often, and we all knew.
A 2006 letter reveals the Vatican's ambassador to the U.S. was informed back in 2000 of serious matters involving some of the students at a seminary in New Jersey where McCarrick was archbishop. So why then was McCarrick, a known sexual predator whose actions some say were an open secret, allowed to repeatedly visit this elite seminary, potentially putting students at risk? Archbishop John Myers ran the Newark Archdiocese and oversaw the payout of settlements in 2005 and 2007 to quiet allegations involving McCarrick. He's also been the chairman of the NAC's board since 2006. He told CBS News he had informed the college about McCarrick, though would not say when. But both the former head of the NAC, Bishop James Cecchio, and its current head, Father Peter Harmon, told CBS News they were never warned. Harmon wrote in an email, "The simple fact is no one was apprised. I saw it on the news this June." There are no public allegations that McCarrick abused anyone at the NAC, but that a known predator was allowed to roam free is another example that despite evidence of a threat, the Catholic hierarchy did not act. Seth Doan, CBS News, Rome.
Three words that separate the thousands of Pennsylvanians who say they were molested as children by Roman Catholic priests from receiving both justice and compensation for their suffering. Those three words are statute of limitation. And that's the reason why just 2 of the 301 priests named in the grand jury report on sex abuse of children by priests have been charged with crimes. Joining me to talk about this is Molly Barrows, legal journalist for Trial Lawyer magazine. Molly, kids and Catholics. I mean, same story. We've done this story, but every week we're finding some new edge to it. What is your take on this issue? statute of limitations. They have things they can do.
Exactly.
Legislation can take care of this.
Well, and to me, that's what this is really about, because it just keeps coming up. As we talked about before, the Catholic Church has continued to get a barrage of criticism, whether it's in the United States, this latest grand jury report in Pennsylvania, even in Ireland, apparently ground zero for a lot of these claims of abuse going back for decades. But basically what's going on in Pennsylvania is they've got recommendations from the grand jury that spent 2 years looking into this, saying, hey, if we really want to do right by these victims, find justice for them, then we need to make some real changes to our law. And that includes changing the statute of limitations. It also means not having these victims sign non-disclosure agreements that keep them from being able to report this and work with law enforcement. So what I feel like we're seeing now is this is the time that they could make some real changes that would help these victims, and they're not. They're still making it political.
Molly, you've been a reporter many years. You've covered a lot of stories on this very topic. One thing that this seems so apparent, we're seeing it with the Pope. Don't say anything.
That's right.
Don't comment on it, because what we've seen historically is these kinds of things take place, and then the Catholic Church says as little as possible. And sure enough, the media that is so, it's not a shiny thing. The media doesn't have the attention span of a fly. They can't pay attention to it for more than a little bit of time. So the Catholic Church has used that as part of their playbook, haven't they?
Absolutely.
You see that happening here? What's your take as far as what your experience covering these stories? You've covered many of them.
Yes, and it's the exact same thing you see time and time again. The system, whether it's apathy of the system or deliberate choices by people within it, whether it's law enforcement or these priests or people within the community, they had different allegiances and agendas, and none of them were for the victim. None of them were doing the right thing. So many of these victims don't really have a hope of finding any kind of justice, because lawmakers in Pennsylvania are really refusing to take up the matter, if you will, or make decisions on statute of limitations. Right now, they can only file a civil suit until the age of 30 if you're abused as a child, and file criminal charges all the way up until you're 50. But these are charges going back decades.
Well, part of this is and you've seen it in the cases that you've covered. Part of it is cultural. You have the Catholic Church so strong up there, they affect local politics.
Exactly.
They affect the police department. They affect the media. They affect the whole mindset, because they do things like they'll have Catholic schools, and the PR machine that they're bringing out right now is extraordinary.
Money, yes.
It's extraordinary. They have more money than 10 third world countries. And their whole goal here is to hang on to that money.
Absolutely.
And they figured out the cheapest way to do it is to avoid, like you got State Rep, Mark Rossi. Mark Rossi is saying, we need to do something to change the law.
Absolutely.
Look at the criticism that Rossi is already under for saying that. He's getting it from the media. He's getting it from every source. This is part of the playbook, though, isn't it?
It is, because this is a Democrat. Rossi, also a sex abuse victim himself by a priest when he was a child, and he's under the fire from folks like Senate President Joe Scarnati, who is a Republican, who's basically saying, oh, it's terrible what happened to these kids. We do need to make some changes, but it sure shouldn't be retroactive. And that's what folks like Rossi are pushing for, and including the governor as well of Pennsylvania. He's saying at the very least, we need to raise the statute of limitations, to be proactive, create a window that's 2 year, gives 2 years for these older victims to come forward and file civil suits so that they can receive some kind of justice. And Rossi also brings up another important point, and this is why I think so many victims don't feel like they're really getting justice, is he's saying this is a public safety issue, not just statute of limitations like, oh gosh golly, I can't point the finger at my accuser anymore or go after them for some cash. They can't catch these people who are still doing this. There's no cure for pedophilia.
Here's what's interesting about it. They can still charge these priests if they want to. You understand? They can still charge them with crimes. They can still parade it through as far as it'll go in a trial. There's a lot of things they can do if they were willing to do it.
And they're not.
But the truth is the Catholic Church has such control. Go to Boston, they run Boston.
Sure.
Go to parts of Pennsylvania, they run parts of Pennsylvania. Anytime you have that Catholic stronghold where they're in control of politics, they're in control of culture, they're in control of the media, this playbook that we're talking about is so classic. There's not one thing, there's nothing at this point that prevents them from going ahead and making some charges even if there's problems with the charges down the road, the story can be told and something can be done about this.
They could also improve their image with people around the world and bring justice to these victims of pedophiles and put a stop to them and put them in prison.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, you talked about Ireland. Even in Ireland, my God, how do you get any more Catholic than that? Finally, the people are taken to the streets saying, enough, Mr. Pope, you need to be heard on this.
Right.
You need to say something.
No more
You can't
words.
just start talking about garbage in the ocean. Can you imagine? Now, that's a problem. Don't get me wrong.
But it's offensive when your problem is
yeah,
abuse.
he's talking about garbage in the ocean rather than talking about the bottom feeder freaks.
Exactly.
The bottom feeder freaks that seem to overwhelm the Catholic Church at this point. And until we get somebody who's much more aggressive and is willing to say, you know, here they are. We're not going to defend them anymore. Justice system, do what you need to do with these folks because we're done with it. We're tired of protecting.
And people should be done with it.
Yeah.
But you're right, Pap. We'll follow it, see if they actually make any real decisions.
Molly, thank you for joining me.
Thanks,
okay.
Pat.
It's a pity. My 3 children received their confirmation in this church, and now it is a mosque. But what can you do? It's awful when a church gets removed for a mosque, although they really made it beautiful.
Of course, it is a different culture and faith, sure, but there are also so many parallels, and therefore we have to be reasonable and stand together.
When I just walked past, I had a strange feeling, a little bit frightening. When I'm in the bus, for example, and I see a crowd of people coming from a mosque, it is a frightening feeling because you feel as a stranger yourself.
A mosque is a place of integration and learning.
I don't think you can say that a German is a Christian automatically nowadays.
President Trump doubled down on an America First agenda Tuesday at the United Nations, despite being surrounded by an audience of world leaders. In a speech addressing the UN General Assembly, the president issued a warning to other countries, saying, quote, "The U.S. will always choose independence and cooperation over global governance, control, and domination." CBS News White House correspondent Weijia Zhang is at the UN with the latest.
At times, President Trump's promise of America First sounded more like America alone during his speech at the United Nations.
We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism.
The president reserved his most stern rhetoric for Iran, scolding the regime as he forcefully stood by his decision to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal.
Iran's leaders plunder the nation's resources to enrich themselves and to spread mayhem.
Mr. Trump commended North Korea for its willingness to negotiate a deal to denuclearize.
I would like to thank Chairman Kim for his courage and for the steps he has taken, though much work remains to be done.
A stark contrast to what he said during last year's speech.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
During the liveliest part of President Trump's speech today, he drew ridicule when he boasted about what he's done for the U.S.
My administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. America's so true. Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
Weijia Zhang joins me now from the United Nations here in New York. Weijia, President Trump put his America First policies at the forefront of his remarks Tuesday. This has been the focus of a lot of critics, but
Is this kind of rhetoric actually surprising from this president?
Well, it's certainly exactly what we hear when we attend Trump campaign rallies, and he is committed to making America great again, America first. But remember, this is not that setting. This is a massive world stage where the spirit of the United Nations is really cooperating together, and this idea of globalism to work toward the same goals. In fact, just about an hour before President Trump's address, the UN Secretary General spoke to the General Assembly and said that global cooperation is the world's best hope. And then you have the president saying that he is committed to cooperating with other countries, but he rejects the ideology of globalism and embraces patriotism as though the two are mutually exclusive. And so to hear the president talk about that here is a little bit different from hearing it at a campaign rally or at the White House, where we would expect to hear it.
And we know that President Xi Jinping of China was not in attendance today, and this comes as the trade war wages on, with the U.S. announcing tariffs on roughly $200 billion of Chinese imports last week. Did the president address these escalating tensions with China?
Absolutely, and he used the same sort of language that we've been hearing, that he's been using to defend his strategy to bring China to a level playing field, as he says, by implementing new tariffs, even though China has responded each time. But he says the U.S. will not be abused as it has for decades, and it will not be taken advantage of, and that he's really looking out for the American people when he issues these tariffs that are leading to an all-out trade war because China has retaliated during the last round, and the administration is threatening even more.
And Weijia, the president also focused on North Korea Tuesday, didn't he? I mean, while he praised Kim Jong-un, he said sanctions needed to remain in place until denuclearization occurs. Could the president's tone be an indication that a second summit between the two leaders could happen soon? I mean, he has said as much.
Right, not just his tone, but his very own words, that he believes a second summit will happen in the not-too-distant future. He hasn't talked about any dates or possible locations, only saying that it will likely not be Singapore and it will be somewhere else. And so he seems very optimistic about meeting again with Kim Jong-un. And as you mentioned, he praised Kim during his speech, thanking him for his courage, for coming up to the plate and his willingness to negotiate with the U.S. on a deal to denuclearize. So as far as the president is concerned, he is forging forward, and he believes Kim is as well.
Right. And we are exactly 6 weeks away from the midterms. So is this sort of America First rhetoric part of the Trump administration's plan ahead of November?
Absolutely. I mean, this is what got President Trump elected, and the administration believes it is what will keep Republicans in control and at least very competitive. And, President Trump recently has started saying that a vote for a Republican in November is a vote for me, because they will protect my policies and my agenda, which again are all fueled by this mantra of America First. And so it's not surprising that he said it here, even though the audience was the United Nations. Of course, he knows who's watching. He knows his supporters are watching, and I think he was talking to them as well.
Indeed. Weijia Zhang at the UN. Thank you.
Sure.
Tensions between the United States and China are escalating. The Trump administration shows no sign of slowing down. Sarah Montez de Oca joins us with the details. Sarah, we know President Trump does not like to lose, and it looks like he's started to try to counter some of those potential losses in his talks with China.
That's right, Scotty. President Trump's trade wars with countries like China and Canada, it seems like President Trump is just looking to compensate for some of his losses. President Trump met with Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe at the UN General Assembly on Wednesday. They agreed to start negotiations to promote bilateral trade. The two countries agreed to work together to seek ways to solve any tariff-related issues. Abe noted, "We must by no means turn back the clock. In fact, we need to be more active in trade investments to build on this relationship." And earlier this week, Trump signed a first and major trade agreement with South Korea. Following this meeting, the president said that he plans on holding a second summit with North Korea in the near future, a commitment that South Korea's Moon Jae is and has been looking for. He claims the details will be announced pretty soon. While Trump planned on meeting with members of the EU to discuss trade, he lashed out on European trade policies this week, saying that they're worse than China. In what was likely a rebuke to Trump, French President Macron said yesterday that the French will only consider trade deals with countries who signed the Paris Climate Accord. This can technically be interpreted as sanctions against the U.S., but President Trump pulled out of that agreement just last year. Although Macron did not mention President Trump by name, Macron did reject Trump's strategy on Iran and his trade deal overall. He also said that bilateral agreements, new protectionisms, will not work, but many Americans are concerned.
Well, I mean, he has the deal with South Korea, of course. It was essentially a revamp of the Obama South Korean free trade deal. So that's one. But look, he's ostracizing people left and right. The U.S. has been known for pushing its weight around as the 800-pound gorilla. But quite frankly, a lot of nations around the U.S., you could tell earlier in the week at the UN, we were giggling at the president. So rather than the 800-pound gorilla, the president has become somewhat of a chimpanzee. And that's unfortunate because there's so much important work to do. I hope we get it done. I hope we get better trade deals. But right now, it really remains unclear, uncertain, and I am not, frankly, optimistic about the circumstance.
Meanwhile, Trump slammed Canada over their NAFTA negotiations. The president claimed that he rejected a one-on-one meeting with Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, saying that his tariffs are just too high. But Trudeau denied even asking for the meeting.
I did.
Why?
Because his tariffs are too high and he doesn't seem to want to move, and I've told him forget about it. And frankly, we're thinking about just taxing cars coming in from Canada. That's the mother lode. That's the big one.
The U.S. is expected to publish a new NAFTA framework by the end of this week, except this time the trade deal will likely consist of bilateral trade between the U.S. and Mexico and exclude Canada. The Trump administration is pushing for the new trade deal to be signed by December 1st, before Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto leaves office. But Canada says that it plans to stick to NAFTA talks despite Trump's attack. Trudeau seems very optimistic about the deal, saying a good, fair deal is still very possible and that they won't sign a bad deal for Canadians. Now, Scotty, meanwhile, U.S. behavior is obviously leading some of these countries to make side deals with Canada and EU for some trade partnerships.
Well, even in President Trump's discussion yesterday, he mentioned the new name for NAFTA, which could be USM, but he didn't necessarily say he would add C onto the end of it. So very interesting as we watch.
That's right.
Thank you.